Welcome back to Face the Nation. Virginia Senator Mark Warner is the top Democrat on the Intelligence Committee, and he joins us here. Senator, as a Democrat, how do you remember Bush 41?
President Bush was a class act, and I think he realized, and reflecting on this program this morning, American leadership is critical. But that leadership needs to be both economic, military, but also moral leadership. And I think President Bush, to think about the transition from the end of the Cold War, as Vice President Cheney was mentioning, or his ability to deal with the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square massacre in China, or the situation with Kuwait, he always knew that America was stronger with alliances, and the rest of the world looked to that American leadership in all of those realms, as I mentioned, militarily, economically, but also morally. And I think it would be all of us, as we reflect on his legacy, to remember that those lessons are still important for all of us to keep in mind.
It sounds like you're describing a different brand of republicanism than what you're seeing now.
A bit different, yes.
I want to get to your role right now on the Senate Intelligence Committee, where you are the ranking member. This week, we heard that the president's former personal attorney, Michael Cohen, pled guilty to lying to Congress about financial interests, specifically a building in Moscow that the Trump organization was seeking to build during the campaign. And that was reportedly discovered after the special counsel came and asked your committee for a transcript of what Michael Cohen had said. What does all of this signal to you?
Well, it signals, one, that if you lie to Congress, and I was with our chairman, Chairman Burr, on Friday, where he said, if you lie to Congress, we're going to go after you. We're going to make sure that gets referred. And we've made a number of referrals.
It's rare to go forward with the prosecution.
And we've made a number of referrals. But I think what it also says is that Donald Trump, as a candidate, said no dealings with Russia. I think if I'd been a Republican delegate going into the summer of 2016, I think it would have been a relevant fact to know that actually Donald Trump was still trying to do business with the Russian government. Maybe that's why he was so reluctant to say anything bad about Vladimir Putin. What we also know at this point is not only were this ongoing business deals, but you had the president's son and his son-in-law meeting with Russians. We had the president's campaign aides being aware that there were the Hillary Clinton emails. We had the president's campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, offering to brief Russian agents. There seems to be all of these paths lead to ties with Russia, and Mr. Trump continues to deny any of that.
Well, the president is essentially saying seeking a profit is not a crime, right? And separating out this allegation of collusion with Russian intelligence versus his organization's business interests.
But Margaret, what I'd say is we can debate whether it's a crime or not, but he was, during that period, was denying any ties to Russia. And I do think it would have been a relevant factor, frankly, for Republican delegates to know that during that time period when he was saying only good things about Vladimir Putin, as a candidate for president, he was still trying to do business with that very same government.
Do you know that candidate Trump knew about the pursuit of this tower?
Again, I only know what Mr. Cohen has said, and clearly most of the individuals that are affiliated with Trump have led themselves into being accused of lying.
Was he instructed to lie, Michael Cohen?
I don't know. I think that is a very relevant question that the American people need an answer to.
You said at the beginning of our conversation you've made a number of referrals. Now, to be clear, what you're investigating here is sort of parallel to what the special counsel is doing there in terms of pursuing criminal charges, potentially. But we saw these two probes intersect this week. When you say you've made a number of referrals, are you saying you've said to the special counsel a number of Trump associates are lying and we have proof of it?
Again, I'm not going to go into which individuals have been referred.
But what were they referred for?
Well, if we've seen something that we feel it would be appropriate to go to the special prosecutor, as Chairman Burr mentioned, we'll make those referrals. And we want to make clear that lying to Congress is a crime.
In the case of Michael Cohen, the special counsel came to you. Is that correct?
We have an ongoing relationship with the special counsel. We have, as you said, though, two different approaches. The special prosecutor is a criminal investigation. We are a counterintelligence investigation, and we've concluded, obviously, that Russia intervened massively, and we need to preclude that from happening again. We're also looking into the question of whether there was collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians. I believe there are clear evidence that the Russians were offering information about Hillary Clinton. We know that. That's been documented in a number of these meetings. The question about whether it was full collusion, that is something both Chairman Burr and I are reserving judgment until we see all of the witnesses, and we've got more folks to see.
A matter of other business, you saw the president at this gathering of world leaders in Argentina. He unveiled what is an agreement, I guess, in principle with Mexico and Canada for a new free trade deal. He says he's going to reject the old NAFTA and get this new one approved and in place, no problem. Is it going to be that simple?
It's not going to be that simple. Candidly, I've not done a full review at this point, but I think he could have actually renegotiated most of this activity within the existing NAFTA framework. But he wanted to put his own stamp on, and now Congress has a right to come in and review whether it's labor, whether it's environmental, whether the deal is actually better. I think these are all open questions, and I think you've already seen pushback from folks on both sides of the aisle.
And you're not ready to say you're going to vote for or against it?
I'm not ready at all at this point.
All right. Senator, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We'll be right back with more Face the Nation and our panel. For more insight into this week's political news, we're joined now by Jeffrey Goldberg, editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, plus David Nakamura and Seung Kim, both of whom covered the White House. David from the Washington Post, Seung from Capitol Hill these days. Seung, we just spoke to Mark Warner on Senate Intelligence, who was sort of making sense of how he sees the decision for Michael Cohen to plead guilty to lying to Congress. This is not a crime that is very often prosecuted. How is this decision to move ahead sort of seen on Capitol Hill? Is this tightening the probe more closely around the president, or is this just a prosecution?
Well, what I find really interesting about the charge that Michael Cohen pleaded guilty to over the week, lying to Congress, is remember that a lot of people have talked to Congress throughout the course of all these Russia investigations. The panels that have been investigating the Russia issues have been House Intelligence Committee, the Senate Intel Committee, which Warner is one of the heads of, and the Senate Judiciary Committee. And there are a lot of characters who have given a lot of different statements to Congress. And what I found really stark, in addition to Senator Warner's comments on your show, was what Senator Burr, the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, said just on Friday at a forum in Texas. And he said, if you lie to Congress, we're going to come after you. Mm-hmm. And he says the committee is constantly reviewing testimony that they had gotten over the last year, looking for inconsistencies. They've made referrals to the special counsel, to DOJ. So that's a pretty big hint to us that we should continue to watch what Mueller is up to.
And Senator Warner said a number of referrals have been made, suggesting he's not the only Trump associate to have lied to Congress.
Yeah, no, one of the amazing things here is that we're all, the country, the world even, waiting for the Mueller report. We're getting the Mueller report. Every day he's writing the report for us through these investigations, through these informations, through these prosecutions. I think I was just on the Hill this week asking a number of Democrats how aggressive they think this is going to get. They think it's going to get extraordinarily aggressive, and we're going to be entering a whole new phase where the subpoenas are going to be coming flying fast and furious, and the fights between the White House and Congress over who will be able to testify, they're going to be ferocious.
I mean, you're already seeing it even in other places. I mean, that you're seeing anger from the Hill about the administration's cooperation or lack thereof in briefing over the murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. I mean, you had two senior officials go to the Hill, Mattis and Pompeo, and deliver some sort of a briefing about what the administration knows about this, but Gina Haspel, the CIA director, was not there. And so you're already seeing Lindsey Graham and others, even on the Republican side, being upset about this administration and them trying to do oversight. So I think...
Right, and if Trump loses Lindsey Graham on this, you know how the rest of the Hill is going to take this.
Well, I want to come to one of the other disputes on the Hill, which was Republican Senator Jeff Flake this week. He got a lot of flack from fellow Republicans for his decision to withhold his vote, basically hold it hostage until there is some sort of hearing for this bill to protect the special counsel from being fired. Many Republicans say this is a lost cause. Why is Jeff Flake pushing this when Republican leaders will never let this go to a vote?
Well, this is his last grasp of power since he's leaving office in a few weeks. But he has told us several times that he has felt increasingly concerned about the fate of the Mueller probe, particularly triggered by the appointment of Matt Whitaker as the acting attorney general. We know Mr. Whitaker has had public comments before his current position that disparage the Mueller probe. Mostly all Democrats share that concern as well. But I've been asking some Republican sources, why not just give Jeff Flake the quote or the vote so he can move on? You guys can vote on
Parting gift.
Exactly. You guys can vote on all the judges that you want. But this would be a very difficult vote. First of all, people say don't want to reward bad behavior on Capitol Hill, but sometimes that works. And also, it's going to be a difficult vote for a lot of Republicans, and they want to avoid that.
I want to ask you about your organization's reporting, though, on this issue as well, because Jeff Flake was blamed for blocking a certain federal judge from moving ahead. And it's really not just all about Jeff Flake on this one particular issue, right? You had uncovered some reporting about Thomas Farr.
Exactly. So Thomas Farr was a person who was up for a federal judgeship in North Carolina. He had worked for the former Senator Jesse Helms in '84 and '90. And we at the Washington Post uncovered an old DOJ memo earlier this week that a lot of senators, a growing group of senators, including Senator Tim Scott, who eventually said he would vote against the nominee, but other senators as well, that said it raises questions about whether this nominee, Thomas Farr, had any knowledge or involvement in this effort to disenfranchise black voters in North Carolina during the 1990 campaign. So it shows a couple of things. First of all, that while Trump has had a lot of success in transforming the federal judiciary in a conservative fashion, he's still running into a lot of obstacles because of the types of nominees that he picks. And two, the Senate, very narrow majority in the Republican Senate, so one person really does have a lot of power here.
David, the president, in leaving Argentina and the gathering at the the G20 gathering of world leaders, has said there was a major success in coming to agreement with Xi Jinping of China. What was actually agreed to?
I think it's a more limited success. It did avert, something of a potential, I don't want to say catastrophe, but next level of this trade war with China, because new tariffs could have gone into effect at the beginning of next year, but they seem to have averted that at least for 90 days. They basically said they're going to have a truce, sort of a temporary ceasefire on these tariffs. The president will not raise the $200 billion in tariffs from 10% to 25%, something China really didn't want to happen. In return, China will agree to buy some more goods. And to declare fentanyl as a controlled substance, something the president really wanted to sort of show that he was making inroads in his war to sort of deal with the opioid crisis. But I think more deeper analysis shows that these intrinsic problems between the U.S. and China on trade are not going away. And to say that it could happen within 90 days is somewhat unrealistic. It's something that's gone on for a couple years now.
It does seem, though, that he blinked a little bit. There's a lot of bluster about China, and then when push comes to shove, here we are. But he was generally, oddly, or uncharacteristically subdued, I think, at the G20, which is to say there were no, he signed onto the statement, there were no outbursts. The drama was with Putin and Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi crown prince. There was no associated drama. He was, if you didn't know better, you would say that he had following a playbook written by more traditional presidents in multilateral settings. And I just found that noteworthy.
He canceled a press conference, deferred to George, the eulogies to George H.W. Bush as well. But, I think, the president is feeling pressure on trade. The announcement from GM to lay off 15,000 people, other, sort of stock market volatility we've seen over the last couple months has worried the White House. This is something, obviously, the economy, they're one of their biggest focuses as he sort of starts to enter his re-election campaign.
Right. It's a success of the economy the president says he's not being given credit for. Seung, how easy will it be to get this new NAFTA, the USMCA as the president's branding it, through?
Not easy at all. I just started looking through statements of what senators have said on this deal. You have Elizabeth Warren saying it doesn't have enough protections for workers. You have Senator Pat Toomey, as free trade as you can be, saying he doesn't like these provisions involving investor protections in that new agreement. And you have Senator Rubio also saying this deal is going to really hurt Florida's seasonal vegetable grower industry. So there's a lot of broader philosophical concerns, parochial concerns. And so either the administration is going to have to really twist arms here or work out a lot of side deals.
Very quickly, has a government shutdown been averted?
check back in with us on Friday, and we'll see.
Check the president's
You
Twitter
never,
feed.
you never say
Exactly,
that.
exactly. The president had hinted possibly he might sign off on something that would buy a bit more time and deference to allow those to mourn the passing of Bush 41. But we will see. That is the safe bet in Trump's Washington. Let's see what happens.
Right.
We'll be back in a moment with our panel and look back at the legacy of George H.W. Bush. We're back now with Bob Schieffer, plus Susan Page, Washington Bureau Chief for USA Today and author of The Matriarch, Barbara Bush and the Making of an American Dynasty. Also joining us is Jerry Seib of the Wall Street Journal. All three of these very esteemed journalists have covered Bush 41 and Washington through the years, so can really give us that perspective. And Jerry, I want to start with you because you've been taking a look at the impact 41 had in terms of global leadership.
Yeah.
What was that legacy?
Well, I mean, it's a remarkable period of time. You had the Tiananmen Square episode, you had the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the reunification of Germany. But I think there are two things really that ought to be remembered. One is he oversaw the end of the Cold War and the unification of Germany without a shot being fired, which was a really remarkable achievement, was not a foregone conclusion. He probably didn't get enough credit for it at the time.
Angela Merkel gave him credit for it the other day.
She should have. So, and the second, of course, the Iraq War. And I think what's interesting about the first Gulf War was he went into Kuwait, he led a coalition, they drove Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait back into Iraq, and then he stopped. In other words, he said, our mission is limited, we're going to free Kuwait, and we're not going to go in and try to change the government in Iraq. And so we learned some years later that was a very wise decision.
What you're describing here, multilateralism, working with allies, restraint, speaking out at times about shared values versus national interests. This sounds like a in some ways, anachronistic description of Republican Party, values and standards. Is it?
George Bush was part of that generation that shaped world order after World War II. And just to add to one thing that Jerry said, in addition to going into Kuwait and then going back and stopping, he also got that remarkable coalition of countries that he put together to pay for it,
right.
which is almost unheard of in this day and time. They actually paid for it. But George Bush he represented mainstream Republican thinking of that time, and that is that America is part of the world. He had great respect for our alliances. He understood that when America was at its best was when we were working with people who shared our values, our allies. He had a great respect for NATO and all of these alliances that came about after World War II. So the fact that he had all these jobs, he had this great resume, he actually learned from it. I mean, I think you can say that he while he was there, he just didn't sit around. He learned a lot.
And it's interesting, Susan, because these days we talk about not being part of Washington, coming in with different experience as being a virtue, whereas what you're describing is he held experience at the very highest levels of power bases here in Washington before getting to the Oval Office.
And the passage of time has been kind to George H.W. Bush. We talk about journalism being the first draft of history, but the second draft sometimes looks different than the first draft. And I think some of the things that some of the consequences of his presidency look so much better with the passage of time, including, for instance, his restraint in dealing with Saddam Hussein and the situation in Iraq. Some presidents seem smaller after a little time has passed. George Bush seems bigger than he did at the time he was defeated for a second term, something that left a terrible wound, although I think not some big scars on him, healed when his son was then elected.
And what is the domestic legacy here? I mean, we're talking about his place in the world, but who was he to America?
So, his domestic legacy is marred somewhat because he was seen as being a little insensitive or unaware, not in touch with the economic anxieties Americans were feeling. In 1992, Bill Clinton was exquisitely, I'm not sure I can say that word, aware of that. But his domestic legacy is actually pretty muscular. He signed the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's a significant piece of legislation. He gave a national address on addressing AIDS. And I think it's easy for us to forget now how much of a breakthrough that was at that time. A great stigma attached to HIV/AIDS. He gave an address, and in the address talked about the lessons he learned from the death of his daughter from leukemia. At the time she died, leukemia also had a great stigma. He talked about the need to address people with AIDS with respect and dignity, and that was a remarkable speech that he gave during his presidency.
You know, I've read interviews where 41 said he didn't like the word dynasty or, talking about his family. But he was the son of a senator and the father of a president. Is the Bush family still going to continue to be part of this sort of political landscape of this country, or are we seeing the sunset on the type of republicanism, the type of leader that you all are describing?
Well, in a way, I think that George H.W. Bush is sort of the last of the breed. I mean, this was a generation, as Bob said, that when he came to Washington, the town was full of people who were bonded by joint service in World War II. Which was more important than where they came from, more important than the party they represented. And that's been lost. And I think one of the other things that's been lost is the kind of the sense of decency and civility that I think he represented, and that in many ways the Bush family represented. And the Bush family's political history is woven all through the 20th century history of America. Will that be true in the 21st century? I'm not so sure. But there is a sense in which I think the George H.W. Bush version of republicanism is kind of gone.
That's an interesting point, too. I mean, George H.W. Bush and his son both had great respect for the presidency, the office of the presidency. George W. Bush, you didn't come into the Oval Office unless you were wearing a suit and tie. And he got that from his dad. I mean, you can say, well, that's kind of whatever. But the fact is, it shows the respect and the dignity that the office deserves. And they were very big on that, and I think they were right about it.
And they extended that to the current president. Obviously the Bush family had a lot of conflicts with Donald Trump, including the fact that he defeated Jeb Bush for the Republican nomination in 2016. We know that the Bushes George and Barbara Bush didn't vote for Donald Trump, but he's invited to the funeral. And I think there was never any question that would happen, because in George Bush's mind, that was the right thing to do, to show respect to the current occupant.
He did not attend Barbara Bush's funeral.
He did not. Now, there is some history where sitting presidents do not attend the funerals of former first ladies. So that was not a break with precedent. But we have little doubt that Barbara Bush did not think much of Donald Trump. And she was a woman who spoke her mind. She wrote in her son's name when she voted in 2016 for president.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, all of you. I know throughout the week we're going to be remembering the legacy of 41 here on CBS. And we will be right back with Face the Nation. Stay with CBS all week, where we will have continuing coverage as the nation pays tribute to the 41st president. He will be laid to rest on Wednesday, and we will have coverage of it throughout our CBS platforms. But for us on Face the Nation, that is it for us today. Thank you for watching. Until next week on Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.